The book of Esther presents what the life of the Jews who were still in Babylon like after the exile. So they'd been able to return from the exile from 539 to 537 whenever Cyrus makes his decree. But there are some who remained or who stayed in exile in Babylon. And so it's a picture of what their life was like, but it's a picture of even in the midst of their staying there, God being with them or in their presence. So the historical overview, this is taken from these events, and this timeline is taken from the ESV Study Bible. It gives kind of this picture of what's going on in this time period. So Cyrus, the king of Persia, he takes over Babylon. He makes a decree, allows the people to return back into the land. They start to rebuild the temple by rebuilding the altar. There's opposition, which we see in the books of Ezra, the beginning of the book of Ezra. They finish rebuilding the temple under the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets. And then there's a bit of silence, like for major events at least. The book of Esther happens right in between the time where they finish rebuilding the temple and the time when Ezra and Nehemiah begin coming and bringing about their reforms. So they're still in Babylon. They are still in, although it's Persia at this time, but they're still in captivity. And to think about the Persian background about what's going on, Xerxes, who your translation may call Ahasuerus, it's the same guy. Xerxes is the name that's typically used kind of in the Western world if you're using most translations that are kind of in the middle of the spectrum or are a little bit more interpretive. It's going to say Xerxes. If you're using one that's a little bit more literal, it's probably going to say Ahasuerus, which would have been kind of his Persian slash Babylonian pronunciation of his name instead of the Greek pronunciation of his name. It doesn't matter. It's the same guy. He's the one reigning within this book. Artaxerxes is the one that we see reigning in the book of Nehemiah. And in Ezra's time, Ezra and Nehemiah's time. He's referenced in Ezra 4:6 and likely also in Daniel 11:2. He made incursions into Greece but was defeated. So this has been popularized in movies and television. The Persian Empire after this time period, much after this time period, much after the events of the book of Esther, begin to decline under Alexander's rise to power and his building up of Macedonia and Greece that fights against Persia. But Persia during this time period is kind of the world power. Xerxes builds and restores several palaces. He's known for being less religiously tolerant than his predecessors. And so he's pictured kind of like Nebuchadnezzar is in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 3 and in Daniel 4, kind of very hasty, very prideful. But there's a biblical background to the book of Esther as well. The events of 1 Samuel 15, where Saul, the first king of Israel, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, is told to wipe out the Amalekites and to kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and he fails to do so. Willingly. He just doesn't follow the word of the Lord. So if you go back and you read 1 Samuel 15, Saul tries to insist to the prophet Samuel that he has followed the word of the Lord. Samuel comes to him and says, then why do I hear all of these animals making noise? And why is Agag still alive? And what's going on? Saul doesn't do this, and he keeps the devoted things to himself. And we see Amalekites spring up throughout the narrative of 1 and 2 Samuel after that as well. So God rejects Saul for his disobedience, but what we're going to see is the people who are against the people. So the main characters, Esther and Mordecai, are Israelites or Jews from the tribe of Benjamin. And then we're going to see this guy by the name of Haman, who's a descendant of Agag. And so the descendants of Saul and the descendants of Agag are going to be the people who feature prominently within this book, and there's going to be animosity with each other. So if Saul had kept covenant earlier, this wouldn't have been an issue, is kind of the picture that the book of Esther is giving. So the book kind of at a glance, the first two chapters introduce Xerxes, Esther, whose Hebrew name is Hadassah, and Mordecai. Haman is going to be introduced in the next few chapters. He's going to threaten the Jews, and he's going to do everything that he can in order to annihilate them, which again is kind of reversal of what was the command of 1 Samuel chapter 15 with the laws for warfare coming off of Deuteronomy 7 that they were supposed to enact. And then there's this reversal of this threat that God works out in events, to where it's not the Israelites who are in exile who are threatened, but instead it's going to be Haman and his kin and any of those who threaten God's people. And it's going to conclude with a statement of this is how the festival of Purim began. So the problem of Esther, though, before we begin looking at kind of the beautiful literary value of the book, and I would even say the beautiful theology of the book, there's something interesting in Esther. There's one thing that's missing in Esther that's found in every other book in the entire Bible. Do you know what it is? It's that the book of Esther never mentions God directly. Every other book in the Bible does, but the book of Esther views God as working in the background. Not that he isn't sovereign, not that he isn't clearly working. That's not the picture at all. It's just that it just shows him working from a kind of a theological and literary perspective, even though his name is never invoked, even though he's never called upon. So as we move into the book, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So what we see at the beginning, we're going to be introduced to Xerxes and his great power and his hastiness. So what's going to happen is he's going to throw this massive celebration that lasts 180 days. Now imagine this. It's a party that lasts half of a year, basically. That's really crazy. And he calls out one of his wives, Vashti, to dance before himself and before the nobles. This was a very, very lewd kind of thing that he was requesting. That's going on here, and she refuses. And the princes and the nobles become angry and irate, and they say, "You need to depose her as queen." And so he does. But we see kind of the hastiness of Ahasuerus in these early verses, and kind of the pride of Ahasuerus, where it talks about how the greatness of his splendor and the pomp of his greatness, he decides to throw this party for 180 days. But he also is just very hasty, and he's concerned about his public-facing appearance. So what does he do? Well, he kicks Vashti out, and he never sees Vashti again to that point. Well, kind of, he has a harem, so he has many wives. And the picture that is given now is, well, he needs a new lead wife, and so he's going to look among his people to try to find out who that is. So Vashti's banished, and he begins looking for another kind of main queen that's going to kind of be his his main wife. So what happens is Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, Hadassah's cousin, was taking care of her, and Esther was chosen as one of these possible queens. You see Mordecai and Esther continuing a relationship. There's a description of Esther's beauty and the beautifying period where she would have been just perfumed and different things like that over a period of time before she could even come into the king's presence. And what we see is that Esther wins favor, and she's ultimately made queen during this time. And so because Esther and Mordecai, they stay in close contact with each other, he's not allowed in that part of the palace, but he can still talk to her like through the gate and different things like that. While he's standing by the gate, it says that Esther hadn't made known from what lineage of people that she was from. It's just kind of a drop on what's going to come later within Haman's plots against the Jewish people. And Mordecai hears, as this is going on, he hears a couple of the king's eunuchs plotting against the king. So it says that as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes. So it's saying like they sought to kill him. Lay hands on him is kind of a way of saying that they sought to do him physical harm. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated, they found it to be so. The men were both hanged on the gallows, which is going to come up again later, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So the king is saved by Mordecai's advice to Esther. So Esther So this is going to come up later because the king's going to forget about this. It's not going to be, Mordecai isn't going to be rewarded. And what happens is we see Haman come on the scene. This guy comes, he's in the royal court. He's gaining political favor with King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. And what ends up happening is it talks about him being from the line of Agag. And Mordecai, as Haman begins to gain power and authority and honor, all the people bow before him. But Mordecai refuses to bow before him. He won't show him homage. And what happens, and because he's at the gate and he's passing by and he never bows down before him, this enrages Haman to the point of ludicrousy. Just go read these texts, how outraged Haman is over this. And he just can't get it out of his mind. And so all he can think about is plotting evil against Haman, or against Mordecai. And not only does he want to destroy Mordecai, but he wants to destroy all of the Jewish people because of Mordecai's actions. So Haman begins to plot against the Jews, and proposes this to King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes. He even gives him a lot of money in order for him to gain favor, and to basically, he bribes him so that a law can pass to where what ends up happening is he sets into motion this day when he can just basically go through the land and kill the Jewish people at random, because he says these people are against the king and against the kingdom. And Xerxes signs it into law. And we know from Daniel 6 and from the laws of Persia itself that once something is signed into law within Persia, you can't revoke it. This is like a permanent law now. It's past precedent that's taken to a ludicrous extreme. And so Haman is given authority. Haman is told that these things can happen. But remember, Esther, she hasn't divulged who her people are. So they don't know that she is also Jewish. So Mordecai and Esther hear what's going on. And they give a copy of the decree he shows it to Esther and explains to her what's going on. And he says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court. So he tells Esther that she needs to act on this. And Esther says, like, look, if I go into the king without him summoning me, I can die. There's but one penalty, and that is death. And she says, I haven't seen the king for a month. I haven't seen the king for 30 days. So if I go to the king and I request something of him, he might kill me. And Mordecai responds to her, and he says, don't think that you're safe in the palace, Esther. Right? Maybe God has raised you up for such a time as this. He doesn't say God, but it's very clear that God's in the background here. He says, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So God's working behind the scenes. And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai and said, go and hold a fast and do not drink for 3 days or nights. And I will have my young women do the same thing. And if I perish, I perish. If I die, by going in before the king. And she goes in before the king. And the king lowers the scepter and allows her to say, yeah. So she did. Her husband hadn't called her into his presence for 30 days. She hadn't seen him for a month. So she's probably thinking, like, is he mad at me? Have I not found favor in his eyes? Look what happened the last time Vashti came. So you see actually a contrast here between Vashti and Esther. Vashti was bid to come and she wouldn't come. Esther is not bid to come, and she comes, right? She goes to the king, into the king's presence. So you see kind of an opposite, just literarily speaking. So, and what she does is she says to the king, I want to hold a fast, or I want to hold, so after she goes in before the king, she gets the king's favor. She tells the king that her wish is that the king would come to a feast, that he would come and that he would have a party with her. And that's what she plans. She plans this party. And Haman, all the while this party is being planned, is he's invited to the feast along with Esther and the king. He's like the only one who's invited to the feast, and he himself, while he's invited to this feast and while the feast is being planned, he himself is planning on how he can kill Mordecai. and he's building this ludicrously high set of gallows. It's unclear. There's debate on whether this is gallows kind of in a traditional sense that we would think of them in the Western world, or if this is like a spike that would impale someone on. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's an instrument of death. He's preparing these so that he can kill Mordecai on them. And see kind of the lunacy or the extent to which his pride and arrogance have overtaken him. And what happens is there's going to be irony, because that night, the night between feasts, so he goes into the feast one night, and the king says, okay, so tell me what you wanted. Why did you come into my presence? And she says, come and feast with me another night, king. She doesn't quite work up the strength to ask him and to tell him what's going on. So she asks for another night of feasting. And in the middle of those 2 days of feasting, the king is troubled and he can't sleep. So what does he do? Well, he's trying to put himself to sleep maybe, and he decides he's going to read the royal chronicles. And he sees that royal chronicle where his life had been saved by Mordecai. And he realizes that he's never honored Mordecai for what he's done. And so the next morning, what happens is Haman comes in before the king, and the king knows that Haman is a royal and trusted advisor for him. And so what he does is he says, what should happen to the man in whom the king wishes to delight, Haman? And Haman's just like, well, who else could the king want to delight in other than me? And what would I want? Well, I would want to sit upon the king's royal horse and to be dressed in royal robe, and for somebody to cry out, this is what happens. This is what the king does to those in whom he wishes to delight, and just parade him throughout the whole city. So Haman thinks that that's what's going to happen. And so Haman, right, says that, and he gives him that advice. Haman says in the middle of these verses here, like, you should do these things. You should let the guy ride your horse, and you should set his head, and you should put him in royal robes, and you should have your most trusted advisor go out before him and say, this is what happens. This is what is done to the man in whom the king delights to honor. And the king said to Haman, now you can imagine Haman's response here. The king says to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate. Leave out nothing of what you have mentioned. This is like the worst thing that could have ever happened to Haman, right? Haman is plotting the death of Mordecai, and instead of killing him, he has to honor him in front of the entire city. So there's an irony here, right? There's a reversal of fortune that happens. And then there's going to be irony that happens again in the next chapter. All of the instruments of death that Haman had been preparing for Mordecai are going to be used on himself. So Haman has plots in his mind of what's going to happen to himself and what's going to happen to Mordecai, and the exact opposite happens in both times. He's going to honor himself, and Mordecai gets honored. He's going to kill Mordecai, and he's the one who ends up dying on his own instruments of death. So what happens is, during that next day, they go back to the feast. And while they're at the feast, Esther says, like, I'm Jewish, and you've decreed that all of the Jews should be killed. And that was done at the hand of Haman. And the king is furious and angry, and he leaves the room. And when the king leaves the room, Haman goes and he sits on the same couch as the queen, and he's begging her and pleading with her. And the king comes back and he sees him on the same couch as his wife. And this was something that you wouldn't have done in an ancient Near Eastern culture. And he's like, what are you doing? You're even assaulting the queen. And he has, the king is told of Haman's plan to kill Mordecai. And so what he does is Xerxes orders that Haman be killed on those gallows that he made to kill Mordecai. So you can read about those. You can read about that here. And it says the king was, so notice verse 7 and verse 10 here start and end with the same thing. The king is wrathful, and the king's wrath is abated with the killing of Haman. So all of the plots of Haman come to nothing. And not only does that happen, but Esther reveals to Mordecai that Mordecai is her cousin, and they end up gaining favor. Mordecai basically ends up occupying the same kind of position of authority and power that Haman had occupied. And she goes into the king's presence another time, and she asks not only that Haman be taken care of, but anyone else who is plotting against her people, that they could defend themselves against them. So they can't revoke the law because of the laws that are in existence, that you can't revoke any of the laws, but there's another law placed into effect to where they can defend themselves, and they can even defend themselves early, so to speak. And so what happens is on the 13th and then the 14th of the month of Adar, they are able to defend themselves, and they take on all of the people of Haman's household who had plotted against them, and they take vengeance on even more of what was happening. And this ultimately is what institutes the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated today. The book of Esther is read during this feast, and it talks about this. It says, "Then Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is lots, to crush them and to destroy them." So all of those things end up working against him, of course. And so they institute the Feast of Purim. And Mordecai is honored. King Ahasuerus imposes a tax on the land, and all the acts of his power and all of his might and all the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. They were written of in the Chronicles of the King. Are they not written of in the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. And he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. So he moves from a lowly position, right, sitting at the gate, to a high position in one of honor. So God's working behind the scenes in all of these things. There's lots of themes in the book of Esther. One of them is irony, which we saw, right, where the plots kind of work against those people who are plotting them. We also see, again, God working for his people, even when they aren't clearly invoking him. He's still there with them. His presence is still with them. We see kind of a conclusion of that history that was begun in 1 Samuel 15, and we see the installment of the Feast of Purim. In all of these things, I hope that one of the things that you see is God's presence in the midst of his people, even when times seem at their most perilous, even when people ignore or don't focus on God. I don't think that Esther and Mordecai are presented as the most virtuous of people. But God is nonetheless caring for them and for the rest of those Jews who are still in the exile. He is still caring for them and among them. So I pray that you would see God's superintending sovereign care even in the most dire of circumstances, because he is good and his steadfast love endures forever. Now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of his Holy Spirit be with you all. Go in his peace.